The air above the river is not yet warm. It holds the last coolness of the night against your skin, that particular softness that only exists in the hour before the sun breaks the horizon, when the darkness has thinned but the light has not yet arrived. The water moves slowly below, its surface the color of pewter, dimpled here and there by the rings of small fish rising in the dark. Somewhere on the far bank, a lamp flickers, a single point of amber light in the gray, and for a long moment, it is the only warm thing in the world. Mist lies along the river in long, unmoving sheets. It does not drift. It simply rests, the way a cloth rests over a sleeping figure, and beneath it, the water carries its ancient weight quietly toward the sea. The smell here is green and mineral, wet stone, black mud, the faint sweetness of marigolds left in the current from some offering the night before. They turn in slow circles in the shallows, their orange petals softened by the dark water, still bright even now. Long before the world you know, millions of people woke beside rivers like this one. They woke to the same cool air, the same dim light, the same smell of water and earth and smoke from a fire being coaxed back to life in a nearby house. They lived across one of the most ancient, most extraordinary civilizations in human history, a civilization so vast, so intricate, so deeply rooted in the rhythms of the natural world, that even now, more than 2,000 years later, its fingerprints remain on almost everything. The food we eat, the numbers we count with, the stories we tell in the dark. All of it, in some part, flows back to this place, to this river, to these people who rose before the sun and went quietly down to the water's edge to begin another day. Tonight, we are going to follow them. We will not rush. There is nothing here that requires hurry. Instead, we will move slowly through the ancient subcontinent, through its river cities and temple courtyards, its market lanes and cooking fires, its monsoon rains and quiet scholarly halls, and we will try, as best we can, to understand not the grand sweep of empire and war and dynasty, but something smaller and more intimate than that. We will try to understand what it felt like to be alive here. What the days were made of. What the people worried about when they lay down at night, and what they reached for in the morning. These were not mythological figures. They were not symbols or allegories. They were people who felt cold in winter and grateful when the rains came. They burned their flatbread when they weren't paying attention. They had favorite songs. They argued with their neighbors about the placement of a fence. They loved their children with a ferocity that needed no language to express, and they mourned their dead with a grief that is still recognizable across every distance of time. Come back to the river now. The mist is beginning, very slowly, to lift. The Ganges at this hour, or the Indus, or the Yamuna, or any one of the great rivers that served as the spine of life across the ancient subcontinent, was never truly silent. Even in the deepest part of the night, there was movement here, and sound. The water itself spoke in low, continuous murmurs against the stone steps of the Ghats, those wide, worn staircases that descended from the city streets directly into the river, where every morning, as long as anyone could remember, people had come to wash and to pray and to stand for a moment in the current and feel something larger than themselves. The Ghats were built from a pale stone that absorbed the cold of the night and released it slowly through the morning. If you placed your bare feet on the lowest step just now, you would feel it, that deep, stored chill rising through your soles, the stone almost alive with it. Higher up, where the steps were dry, a few figures moved in the gray light. A woman wrapped in dark cloth carried a brass pot down toward the water with the careful balance of long habit. An old man sat motionless on a broad step near the middle, his eyes closed, his lips moving almost imperceptibly, his prayers no louder than breath. The river accepted everything. That was its nature, and it was understood to be so. It accepted the offerings of flowers and oil-lit clay lamps that were set floating on its surface each evening. It accepted the prayers spoken into it by the living and carried the ashes of the dead in its current out beyond the horizon. It was not metaphor. It was not symbol. It was the actual, physical center of life, the source of the water that irrigated the fields, filled the wells, and made possible every city, every village, every cooking fire, every glass of water ever drunk in this landscape. The river was life. It was not a stretch of religious imagination that made it sacred. It was simply accurate. As the light slowly increased, the ghats began to fill. Not quickly, not noisily, but steadily, the way water rises in a well, one figure becoming two becoming a small cluster, voices low and sparse at first, then gradually weaving together into a soft, communal sound that was neither silence nor speech but something in between. The priests who tended the nearby temples had been awake for hours already, performing rituals in the lamplight before the city stirred. Now the first ordinary citizens of the day descended to the water, farmers who rose before sunrise because the fields demanded it, merchants who had accounts to balance and supplies to arrange, mothers with young children balanced on their hips, the children still drowsy, their heads resting sideways against a shoulder, watching the river with the calm, unfocused attention of the not quite awake. This is where ancient India began each day. Not in a palace or a throne room, not in the halls of a great university or the vaults of a wealthy merchant's home. It began here, on these stone steps, in the half-light, with cold water and bare feet and the low sound of prayer carried over a moving river. The civilization you are entering tonight stretches across thousands of years. Its earliest cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, built along the Indus River in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, were already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were new. They had running water and planned street grids and drainage systems of a sophistication that would not be seen again in parts of Europe for another 2,000 years. And long after those cities quieted, the civilization they seeded continued to evolve and deepen across the subcontinent, through the Vedic period and the great epics, through the rise of the Maurya and Gupta empires, through the universities and trade routes and monsoon cycles and sacred rivers that gave shape to daily life for generation after generation of ordinary people. Those people are who we are here for tonight. The sky above the river is turning now. The pewter has softened toward a pale, washed gold along the eastern horizon, and the mist is pulling back from the water's surface like a breath slowly exhaled. A temple bell rings somewhere above the ghat, a single, clear note that travels out across the river and dissolves into the morning air. It is the sound of the day beginning. It is the sound that has rung across this landscape every morning for longer than any record survives to tell us. On the lowest step of the ghat, a small clay lamp from last night's offering has drifted back against the stone and come to rest there, its flame long extinguished, its wick dark with river water. The marigolds that surrounded it have scattered and sunk. But the clay cup remains, small and pale and perfectly ordinary, the work of someone's hands, and in this light, in this early quiet, it is difficult to look at it and not feel, very gently, the weight of all the lives that were lived here. All the mornings that were begun this way. All the feet on these steps. All the prayers spoken into moving water. We have a long night ahead of us. There is much to explore, and all of it will come slowly, at the pace of the river. For now, simply stay here a moment longer in the cool air at the water's edge. Feel the damp stone. Listen to the current. Let the day begin. The sound comes before the light does. It begins as something almost too faint to identify, a low creak somewhere down the lane, the groan of a wooden wheel turning slowly against a stone road, then the soft, rhythmic clop of an ox finding its footing on an uneven surface. A cart is moving through the city before the sun has fully cleared the horizon, its driver wrapped in a length of undyed cloth against the morning chill, his eyes still carrying the last traces of sleep, his hands holding the reins with the loose, automatic grip of a man who has made this same journey so many hundreds of times that his body no longer requires him to think about it. The lane he moves through is narrow. The buildings on either side rise 2, sometimes 3 stories, their walls thick, their windows small and set high, the interior rooms cool even in the heat of summer. The stone beneath the cart wheels is old and worn smooth by generations of feet and hooves and the dragging weight of loaded sleds, and in certain places, where the road dips slightly, the last of the night's dew has gathered in thin, dark pools that reflect the pale sky above in brief, broken flashes as the cart passes over them. This is the ancient Indian city at the moment of its waking. And it woke, as most things in this civilization woke, gradually, not with the sharp, sudden jolt of an alarm, but with the slow and layered accumulation of small sounds and movements, one added to another until the silence of the night had been replaced, almost imperceptibly, by the full, breathing hum of daily life. The cities of ancient India were among the most remarkable human achievements of the ancient world, and yet for a long time, the modern world knew very little about them. It was not until the 1920s, when archaeologists began carefully removing the earth from mounds along the banks of the Indus River, that the true scale of what had been built here began to emerge. Mohenjo-daro, its name meaning, in one translation, the mound of the dead, revealed itself slowly, layer by layer, as something that confounded nearly every expectation. Here were streets laid out in careful grids, running north to south and east to west with a geometric precision that implied not just skill but planning, a city that had been thought about before it was built, designed by people who understood that a well-organized city was a more livable city. The streets of Mohenjo-daro were wide enough for 2 carts to pass each other comfortably. Along their edges ran covered drainage channels, brick-lined, sloped, connected to the private drains of individual houses, a sanitation system more sophisticated than anything that would exist in many European cities for another 2 millennia. The bricks themselves were made to a standardized ratio, the same proportions used consistently across the entire city and across other Indus Valley settlements hundreds of kilometers away, which tells us something important. These cities were not built in isolation. They were connected. They shared knowledge, standards, perhaps even governing principles, across a civilization that at its height stretched across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Walk these streets now, in the early morning light. The shadows are still long, lying across the road in cool blue-gray stripes where the buildings block the low eastern sun. The air smells of damp brick and something faintly smoky, fires being lit in kitchens, hearths being stoked, the first bread of the morning beginning its slow transformation from raw grain to something warm and sustaining. A dog trots purposefully along the base of a wall, nose low, following a scent trail laid down in the dark. It does not look up as you pass. From behind a closed wooden door comes the sound of grain being ground, a heavy, circular sound, stone turning on stone, steady and rhythmic as a heartbeat. Someone has been at this work already for some time. In households across the ancient subcontinent, the grinding of grain was typically among the first tasks of the morning, often begun before dawn, performed by women in the inner rooms of the house while the city outside was still quiet. The sound of it was so constant, so woven into the texture of early morning, that its absence would have felt strange, the way the absence of birdsong feels strange to someone who has always woken to it. Farther down the lane, a woman emerges from a doorway carrying a small clay pot of water, which she pours carefully along the threshold of her home, a daily ritual of purification and welcome that is still practiced in parts of India today, the same gesture made by different hands across an unbroken span of thousands of years. She glances up at the brightening sky, assesses it for a moment the way anyone might assess the day's weather and what it will mean for the work ahead, then steps back inside, the wooden door swinging shut behind her with a soft, decisive sound. The great city of Varanasi, known across different periods of history as Kashi, as Benares, as the City of Light, has been inhabited, by some estimates, for more than 3,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied cities on Earth. To walk its lanes in the ancient morning was to move through a place dense with accumulated time, where every wall had heard centuries of conversation, where the stone steps leading down to the river had been worn concave by the patient pressure of millions of feet, where the smell of incense and river water and cooking fires had been layered together so long and so deeply that the air itself seemed to carry a particular quality of ancientness, as if the atmosphere were slightly thicker here. Slightly more substantial, freighted with all the living that had occurred within it. The lanes of Varanasi were, and in the old city, still are, extraordinarily narrow. They were not designed for carts, in many cases, but for people on foot, for pilgrims moving in slow processions toward the river, for priests carrying offerings, for children running messages between households. They twisted and branched and doubled back on themselves in ways that seemed chaotic from above but made a kind of organic sense at street level, the logic of a city that had grown around the movements of its people rather than imposing a geometry upon them. Every turn revealed something, a small shrine set into a wall with a single lamp burning before it, a pile of copper pots arranged outside a metalworker's door, a sleeping cat arranged with great precision in a patch of early sunlight. The merchants were among the first to animate the day. A cloth seller on a corner near the main market lane had already unrolled 2 bolts of fabric and was holding one up against the light, checking its quality with the particular squinting attention of someone who knows exactly what they are looking at. The cloth caught the morning sun and glowed, a deep saffron, the color of turmeric and of the robes of wandering ascetics, a color so central to the visual life of ancient India that it had accumulated layers of meaning, purity, auspiciousness, the warmth of fire, the turning of the season. He set it down, smoothed it with the flat of his hand, and began folding it with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and unhurried. The spice sellers were arranging their goods in small clay bowls and shallow baskets, turmeric the yellow of old sun, dried red chilies like small curved flames, cardamom pods pale green and papery, black mustard seeds that rolled and scattered if you breathed too close. The smells were extraordinary, complex, almost architectural in their layering, the sharp warmth of pepper built beneath the sweet depth of cinnamon built beneath the clean, green sharpness of dried coriander. To walk past a spice market in the early morning was a full sensory event, the kind that printed itself on memory and was retrievable, decades later, whole and vivid, at the faintest prompting. A child appeared in a doorway at the end of the lane, perhaps 5 years old, her hair still loose from sleep, still holding a piece of flatbread folded in both hands. She stood in the doorway with the absolute, unself-conscious stillness of a small child watching the world before the world has noticed her. She looked at the merchant arranging his spices. She looked at the cart making its slow way up the lane. She looked, briefly, in the direction of the river, where the faint silver thread of the water was just visible between the rooftops. Then she took a slow, careful bite of her bread and continued watching. The city was awake now. Not loudly, not abruptly. Simply, inevitably, the way a river becomes a river, through the continuous addition of small and ordinary things, each one unremarkable on its own, together composing something immense. The sun had cleared the rooftops. The shadows had shortened and warmed from blue to gold. Somewhere ahead, deeper in the city, the day was already in full motion. We will follow it there. Step through the doorway now, and let the city fall away behind you. The transition is immediate. One moment you are in the lane, its sounds, its smells, its particular quality of public, communal air, and then you cross the threshold, and everything changes. The noise softens. The light shifts. The air inside a home in ancient India was a different kind of air entirely, cooler and more intimate, carrying the layered histories of all the meals cooked here, all the nights slept here, all the quiet mornings that began in exactly this way, with exactly this quality of stillness. The walls absorbed it all and gave it back slowly, the way old stone holds warmth long after the fire has gone out. The homes of the ancient Indus Valley were built to last. Their walls were thick, sometimes half a meter of fired brick, the same standardized brick used in the streets and public buildings, pressed into the same careful ratio of length to width to height that appears at site after site across the civilization. This consistency was not coincidence. It was the physical evidence of a society that had thought carefully about how to build, and had arrived at answers it trusted enough to repeat across hundreds of kilometers and hundreds of years. The walls were plastered over with a fine lime finish, sometimes painted in pale earth tones, ochre, cream, a dusty red made from crushed minerals found along the riverbanks. Running your fingers along such a wall would give you a surface slightly rough, slightly cool, slightly yielding, not the cold hardness of marble or the brittleness of dried clay, but something in between, something that felt almost organic, as if the wall were still connected, in some cellular way, to the earth it had come from. The house was organized around a central courtyard, open to the sky. This was not merely an aesthetic choice, though it was beautiful, that open square of sky above, framing whatever light the day offered, reflecting it down into the rooms arranged around the edges. It was practical, deeply so. The courtyard was the lungs of the house. It provided ventilation in the stifling heat of summer, drawing hot air upward and out while the shaded rooms around it stayed relatively cool. It was the place where most of the household's daily activity occurred, where grain was ground and vegetables were sorted and children played and the cooking fire was built each morning in the small, dedicated hearth set into one corner. In the evenings, when the worst of the day's heat had eased, it was where the family gathered, where elders sat and talked, where the youngest children fell asleep on thin cotton mats while the conversation continued quietly above them. The cooking fire was already burning. It had been started before the light came fully, built from dried dung cakes and small pieces of hardwood stacked with care in the low clay hearth. The woman who tended it had learned to build a fire from her mother, who learned from her mother before her, the knowledge passing intact through generations in the way that truly useful knowledge tends to, not through instruction so much as through proximity, through watching and doing and the gradual accumulation of small adjustments that constitute mastery. She knew how to lay the fuel so the heat concentrated where she needed it. She knew the exact moment when the oil in the pan had reached the right temperature, not by measuring it, but by the sound it made, by the way it moved, by the faint shimmer above its surface that told her, with complete reliability, that it was ready. A brass pot of water sat over the fire now, beginning its slow approach to boiling. The water had been drawn from the household well. Most Indus Valley homes of any substance had their own well, lined with the same fired brick as the walls, fitted with a low curb to keep the water clean. This was another of those details, small on its own, that becomes astonishing in context. Private indoor wells in homes built 4,000 years ago. The people who lived here were not enduring privation and making do. They had organized their domestic lives with a sophistication and a concern for comfort and cleanliness that feels, across all the distance of centuries, entirely recognizable. The rooms that opened onto the courtyard were cool and dim. Light entered them in slanted columns through the high, narrow windows, enough to work by, enough to read by, not enough to heat the interior to the unbearable temperatures that gathered outside in the summer months. The floors were of smooth, compacted earth or fired brick, swept clean and sometimes sprinkled with water in the mornings to settle the dust and add a faint, pleasant coolness underfoot. Against the walls, large clay storage jars stood in their places, some sealed with cloth and cord, holding dried lentils and rice and chickpeas, others open, containing the household's daily supply of grain, accessible whenever needed. The smell in these rooms was of clay and grain and something drier and more ancient underneath, the smell of many seasons of storage, of provisions carefully kept, of a family that had learned not to be caught without what it needed. In one corner of the main room, a low wooden platform served as a bed. It was raised just enough off the floor to discourage insects and to let air circulate beneath the sleeping body, another practical consideration, arrived at through the accumulated wisdom of people living in a climate that demanded such adaptations. A thin cotton mattress lay on the platform, and over it a length of cloth that had been woven in the household, its edges slightly uneven in the way of handmade things, its colors faded to a soft, familiar paleness by washing and light and use. A small oil lamp stood on a ledge nearby, its flame extinguished for the morning, a thin thread of cooling smoke still rising from the dark wick. Children moved through the house with the boneless ease of children everywhere. A boy of perhaps 7 crossed the courtyard with great purposefulness, carrying something carefully in both hands, a small clay figure, a toy animal, its legs slightly too short for its body, its surface smoothed by much handling. He set it down in a patch of sunlight near the cooking fire and crouched to examine it with an intensity of focus that suggested it was a matter of considerable importance. Then he looked up, distracted by something his sister said from across the courtyard, and was on his feet again and gone, the clay animal left sitting alone in its patch of sun. The family was large by modern standards, and the house accommodated that largeness without effort. Grandparents occupied a room at the back, quieter, cooler, a little more separate from the daily traffic of the household, though still fully within it. An older daughter sat near the courtyard wall, her fingers moving quickly through the motions of carding cotton, pulling the raw fiber apart, aligning it, preparing it for spinning, her hands performing work they had done so many times that her attention was free to drift to the sounds from the lane outside, to the conversation her mother was having with a neighbor who had appeared at the door, to the small complicated social weather of family life that surrounded her constantly and which she navigated, even at her age, with the practiced attentiveness of someone who had been paying close attention to people for as long as she could remember. Textiles were one of the great productions of ancient Indian civilization. The cotton plant, cultivated here earlier than almost anywhere else on Earth, had been refined through centuries of agricultural attention into varieties that produced a fiber of remarkable softness and length. The cloth made from it was thin enough, at its finest, to be translucent, fine enough to be folded and passed through a finger ring. Ancient sources from Greece describe receiving Indian cotton cloth and finding it almost incomprehensible, nothing in the Mediterranean world compared to it. It was traded along routes that stretched from the Arabian Sea to Mesopotamia and beyond, carried in the holds of boats that made the same seasonal crossing year after year, guided by the same monsoon winds that governed life on land. But here, in this house, the cloth was not a luxury or an export commodity. It was simply what the family wore and slept beneath and used to strain the morning's fresh milk and bind the baby's back when she was carried. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. The water in the brass pot had begun, very quietly, to simmer. Small bubbles rose from the bottom and dissolved before they reached the surface, the first stage, the stage before the full rolling boil, when the water is hot but not yet ready. The woman tending the fire watched it with half her attention, stirring something else in the small pan beside it, the smell of mustard oil and the first faint bloom of warming spices beginning to lift into the courtyard air and drift, slow and fragrant, through the rooms of the house. Outside, the city continued its morning. But here, within these walls, time moved differently. More privately. More warmly. The day was just beginning to organize itself around the fire. There is a particular moment in the preparation of a meal that has no precise name but is immediately recognizable to anyone who has ever stood near a fire with a pan in hand. It is the moment when the oil reaches temperature and the first pinch of spice is added, when the dry, inert powder meets the hot fat and the kitchen fills, in a single breath, with something so vivid and so complete that it registers less as a smell and more as a presence. The air changes. The room changes. Whatever was happening before stops, briefly, and gives way to this. That moment has been happening in Indian kitchens for at least 4,000 years. The food of ancient India was not a primitive precursor to something more refined. It was, in its own right, one of the most sophisticated culinary traditions ever developed, a tradition built on an understanding of flavor, digestion, and the relationship between food and the body that was documented, analyzed, and refined across centuries into what would eventually become Ayurvedic dietary science. The people who cooked in these clay-walled kitchens were not simply feeding themselves. They were, in a way they understood quite consciously, practicing medicine. Every ingredient had a nature, warming or cooling, heavy or light, grounding or stimulating, and the art of cooking was partly the art of combining these natures in ways that suited the season, the weather, the age, and constitution of the person eating. A meal prepared with attention was an act of care so thorough it extended all the way into the future, into the hours after eating, into the quality of the night's sleep and the energy of the following morning. Stand in the kitchen doorway for a moment and simply look. The hearth is low, set into the floor of the cooking area, a shallow depression lined with clay that has been fired by years of use into a smooth, hard surface the color of old terracotta. 3 rounded clay pots sit over the fire at different heights, balanced on rings of twisted clay that hold them steady above the flames. The largest pot holds water, now fully boiling, sending a soft column of steam toward the open roof vent above. The middle pot contains dal, dried lentils that have been soaking since the night before in a bowl near the door, their skins softened, their surfaces slightly puckered from the long immersion, now simmering in fresh water with a piece of dried ginger tucked among them and a pinch of turmeric that has turned the whole thing a deep, warm gold. The smallest pot holds ghee. Ghee, clarified butter, cooked slowly until all its moisture has evaporated and the milk solids have been separated away, leaving behind a pure, golden fat of extraordinary stability and depth, was one of the most sacred and most practical substances in ancient Indian life. It appeared in religious rituals, poured onto sacred fires in quantities that sent great fragrant clouds of smoke into the sky as offerings to the divine. It appeared in Ayurvedic medicine as a carrier for herbs, a lubricant for joints, a treatment for everything from dry skin to poor digestion to troubled sleep. And it appeared in the kitchen every single day, because nothing else did quite what ghee did, that particular richness, that nutty, almost caramel depth that it contributed to whatever it touched, and the way it could be heated far hotter than ordinary butter without burning, making it ideal for the high, fierce heat needed to bloom a spice properly. The woman cooking this morning reaches for a small clay bowl of spices that she has prepared and set beside the hearth. The spices are already measured, not with any instrument, but with the innate calibration of long practice, the pinch and the half palm and the small handful that mean the same thing to an experienced cook that a teaspoon means to someone reading a recipe for the first time. She tilts the ghee pot slightly, checks the surface with a glance, and then adds a handful of whole mustard seeds. The sound they make is immediate and spectacular. A rapid, urgent popping, almost a roar in the small kitchen, the seeds bouncing against the sides of the pot as they burst in the heat, releasing their oil, transforming in an instant from small, inert pellets of compressed flavor into something volatile and alive. She adds the dried red chilies next, 2 of them, split along their length, their interiors pale orange against the dark pot, and then a pinch of asafoetida, that pungent, sulfurous resin that smells, raw, almost aggressively strange, but in hot oil becomes something entirely different, deep, savory, allium-like, the thing underneath the thing. The kitchen fills completely. There is no part of the air in this room that is not, in this moment, saturated with the smell of what is being cooked. She pours the tempered oil over the simmering dal in a long, sizzling stream, and the whole pot exhales. The grains that sustained ancient Indian civilization were many and various, each suited to different soils, different climates, different seasons. Rice grew abundantly in the wetter eastern regions, long-grained, fragrant varieties that were steamed or boiled and served as the centerpiece of the meal, the neutral, sustaining base around which everything else was arranged. In drier regions, millet and sorghum, hardier, more drought-tolerant, formed the bulk of the diet, ground into flour and made into flatbreads cooked directly on the surface of a hot clay griddle, their edges slightly charred, their interiors soft and faintly smoky. Wheat had been cultivated in the Indus Valley since the earliest period of the civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests it was grown here among the very first places in the ancient world where wheat cultivation took root. The flatbreads made from it would have been recognizable to anyone who has eaten roti or chapati today, made from a dough of flour and water kneaded until smooth and then rolled thin and cooked quickly on a dry pan over high heat, blistering slightly in the heat, puffing in places where the steam has nowhere else to go. They were eaten with everything. They were the utensil and the food at once, torn and used to scoop dal, to pick up vegetables, to soak up whatever remained in the pot. Vegetables were abundant. The subcontinent's extraordinary biodiversity, its range of climates and soils, from the humid river deltas of the east to the arid plains of the northwest, made it one of the richest agricultural regions on Earth. Eggplant, which the wider world would eventually come to know through Indian trade, was cultivated here. Bitter gourd and ridge gourd grew on trellised vines along the outer walls of houses. Onions and garlic were used daily, their smell present in every kitchen, their layers peeled back and chopped on the flat stones that served as cutting surfaces. Leafy greens, fenugreek leaves, the slightly bitter, herby green that is still fundamental to Indian cooking, were grown in small kitchen gardens and added to dal and flatbread dough and cooked in ghee with nothing more than salt, their natural bitterness mellowing in the heat into something complex and satisfying. The coconut palm provided everything in the coastal regions, its flesh grated fresh and stirred into curries, its water drunk cool in the midday heat, its dried kernel pressed for oil that smelled of warm beaches and tasted faintly sweet in whatever it touched. Tamarind, the sour, pulpy fruit of a large tree that grew abundantly across the subcontinent, added its particular sharpness to dishes, a sourness entirely different from that of citrus, deeper and more complex, the kind of acidity that made the back of your jaw ache pleasantly and caused your mouth to fill with anticipation before the food even arrived. Honey was the primary sweetener, gathered from wild hives or from the early managed colonies that beekeepers tended in clay cylinders along the edges of fields. Sugarcane had been cultivated here since antiquity. The word sugar itself traces its lineage back through Persian and Arabic to the Sanskrit word sharkara, and the raw cane juice, boiled down to a dark, unrefined block called jaggery, sweetened the desserts and festival foods that marked the turning of the year, the milk pudding scented with cardamom and saffron, the small fried sweets soaked in syrup, the sesame brittle pressed into flat cakes and eaten at harvest celebrations. The dal is ready now. It has achieved that particular consistency that good dal achieves, thick but not heavy, smooth on the tongue but not featureless, The lentils softened completely into the liquid but still present in it, the whole thing unified by the spiced ghee into something coherent and deeply warming. A ladleful poured over rice produces a smell that rises in a quiet, fragrant cloud. Turmeric and ginger and the ghost of those mustard seeds, softened now, integrated, no longer separate notes but a single sustained chord. Somewhere in the house, a child has already smelled it and is on his way. The meal is nearly ready. And in the room where it will be eaten, the courtyard, perhaps, the morning sun now warm enough to sit in, someone is spreading a cloth on the ground and setting out the clay bowls with the quiet, practiced efficiency of someone who has done this every morning of their life, and finds in it, each time, the same small uncomplicated satisfaction. The fire pops once, softly, and settles. You smell it before you see it. The market announces itself from 2 lanes away, a complex, shifting wall of scent that changes as you move closer, one layer giving way to another, each one distinct and then immediately complicated by the next. There is the warm, resinous sweetness of sandalwood paste being sold from a low wooden tray. There is the sharp green bite of fresh coriander bundled in loose, fragrant handfuls and stacked against a wall. There is the darker, heavier smell of raw cotton bales warming in the morning sun, and beneath all of it, persistent and fundamental, the smell of the earth itself, the dust of the road, the moisture that still clings to the shaded corners of the lane, the particular mineral quality of dry stone heated slowly from below by the accumulated warmth of 1,000 consecutive mornings. Then you turn the corner, and the sound arrives all at once. It is not loud, exactly. It is dense. A continuous, layered texture of voices at different volumes and registers, the low, deliberate cadence of 2 merchants negotiating, the higher, carrying call of a seller advertising his goods to no one in particular and everyone at once, the bright percussion of metal against metal somewhere deeper in the market, the occasional bray of a donkey objecting to something nearby, the soft slap of bare feet on warm stone moving quickly through a crowd that parts for them and closes again as naturally as water. To stand at the entrance of an ancient Indian bazaar was to stand at the edge of a living system, complex, self-organizing, regulated by customs and relationships and the invisible accumulated weight of how things had always been done here. The market was the pulse of ancient Indian civic life. Long before coins were struck and standardized, before written contracts were drawn up on birch bark and palm leaf, trade had been happening here, goods moving between hands according to the ancient logic of barter and trust and the social bonds that made both possible. And even after coinage arrived, the small, irregular punch-marked silver pieces of the Mauryan period, stamped with symbols of the moon and the sun and various sacred creatures, each mark a record of where the coin had been struck and by whose authority, the older systems did not disappear. They ran alongside the new ones, woven together into a commercial fabric of extraordinary complexity and resilience. Move into the market now, slowly, the way you would move through any crowded place you wanted to actually see. The cloth merchants occupied their own section, as they always did in a well-organized bazaar, their stalls arranged side by side so that buyers could compare without too much inconvenient walking, their goods displayed with an eye for what the morning light did to color and texture. Cotton cloth lay in folded stacks, plain undyed white, deep indigo blue achieved through a dyeing process of considerable technical sophistication, the rich reddish brown of madder, the warm yellow of turmeric. A bolt of particularly fine weave had been unrolled and draped over a wooden frame so that the sun could pass through it, demonstrating its fineness to any interested buyer. The light came through it in a warm, diffuse glow that was nearly the same as the light through a closed eyelid, a demonstration not only of quality but of a kind of poetry, the fabric so thin it was almost not there. And then there was silk. Silk arrived in ancient India along routes so old that their origins were already mythological by the time anyone thought to record them. From the east, carried overland through mountain passes and river valleys and the great flat expanses of the Asian interior, it came in bolts of impossible luster, a fabric that seemed to generate its own light rather than simply reflect the light of the world, its surface catching and releasing color as it moved, shifting from one shade to another the way still water shifts when the wind touches it. The merchants who handled it did so with a particular quality of attention, carefully, yes, but also with a kind of quiet satisfaction, the pleasure of a person who works with beautiful things and has not yet lost the capacity to find them beautiful. The spice section was several stalls wide and 3 stalls deep, and at this hour, mid-morning, it was the busiest part of the market. A merchant sat cross-legged behind his display, a low, wide board covered with clay cups and wooden bowls, each containing a different dried spice or herb or seed, arranged with a certain aesthetic consideration, the reds and yellows near the center, the pale greens and creamy whites at the edges, the whole display a kind of informal mosaic that was also a complete inventory of flavor. He reached into a bowl and held something out to a customer, a single dried pepper, small and wrinkled and so dark it was almost black, and the customer took it and held it between 2 fingers and brought it very close to his face to smell, and there was something in that gesture, in its particularity and its unhurried attention, that collapsed the distance of centuries entirely. Pepper was among the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. The Romans called India the land of spices, and they paid for those spices in gold, a trade imbalance that concerned Roman senators enough to prompt official complaints, recorded in surviving texts, about the quantities of gold flowing east in exchange for pepper and cardamom and fine cotton cloth. The ancient Indian merchants who received that gold were participants in a commercial network of global scale, one that stretched from the Mediterranean in the west to China in the east and down through the sea routes of the Indian Ocean. The same monsoon winds that brought the rains also filled the sails of trading vessels, carrying goods in one direction through the summer months and the other direction in winter, the whole system powered by the same atmospheric engine that governed the agricultural calendar on land. The harbor towns along India's western and eastern coasts, Bari Gaza on the Arabian Sea, Arakamedu on the Coromandel coast, were cosmopolitan places where Greek and Roman merchants rubbed shoulders with Arab traders and Southeast Asian sailors, where multiple languages were spoken within a single transaction, where the same piece of cloth might change hands 3 or 4 times before reaching its final destination in a Roman villa or a Persian palace or a court somewhere in the mountains of Central Asia. The merchants who navigated this world were not simple traders. They were sophisticated operators in a system of extraordinary reach, men who knew exchange rates and seasonal winds and the credit systems of multiple civilizations, who kept accounts in their heads and on palm leaf ledgers and who built relationships across generations, sons continuing the trading partnerships their fathers had established. The trust accumulated slowly and maintained carefully because it was, in the end, the most valuable commodity of all. Back in the market, the sound of a brass bowl being struck rings once, clear and bright, and fades. A money changer sat at a small table near the market center, an older man, compact and precise in his movements, his table covered with a flat piece of dark cloth on which he had arranged various coins in neat groupings. The punch-marked silver pieces, the copper coins of local issue, the occasional foreign piece that had traveled an enormous distance to arrive in this man's palm, each type in its own group, each assessed by weight and purity with the small balance scale that sat beside him like a piece of furniture so fundamental to his existence that it seemed almost part of him. A woman placed 2 coins on the cloth before him. He picked each one up, held it, turned it once, set it back. He named a figure. She named a lower one. They arrived at a number between them with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this enough times to have stripped the drama from it, leaving only the arithmetic. A young man moved through the market carrying a shallow basket on his head, calling out in a high, carrying voice the name of what he had. Roasted chickpeas, it sounded like, or something very like them. His path through the crowd practiced and weaving, his balance absolute, the basket not shifting by so much as a degree while the rest of him moved fluidly around the elbows and shoulders and sudden stops of the people around him. He had probably been doing this since he was old enough to carry the basket, learning the market's layout and rhythms and the best times to pass through certain areas, accumulating without knowing he was accumulating it a complete and detailed knowledge of the place and its people. The sun had reached the overhead position now. The shadows had pulled themselves in close, tucking themselves directly beneath the stalls and the carts and the standing figures, and the heat of the day had arrived with a particular quality of permanence, not the building heat of morning, which still carries within it the memory of the night's coolness, but the settled, established heat of midday, which does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. The market would continue through the afternoon. It would thin and thicken again and thin once more as the day moved toward evening. Certain sellers would pack their goods and leave. Others would arrive for the later trade. The rhythm of it was ancient and self-sustaining and needed no administration beyond the habits of the people who composed it, each one playing their part with the unconscious fidelity of someone performing a role so deeply familiar that the performance and the self had become, long ago, the same thing. A brass coin turned once in the air, catching the light, and was caught. The transaction was complete. The temple courtyard had been swept before the sun arrived. You can see the evidence of it in the smooth, clean surface of the stone floor, the fine, parallel lines left by a stiff broom drawn across the paving in long, overlapping strokes, the dust displaced to the courtyard's edges where it lies in a thin, pale border against the base of the surrounding wall. Someone was here in the deep dark of the early morning, before the lamps in the nearby houses had been lit, moving through this space in the dark with the quiet, focused attention of a person performing an act that is simultaneously ordinary and sacred. Sweeping the temple courtyard was not merely maintenance. It was preparation. It was the act of making a space worthy of what would happen within it, of clearing away the residue of the previous day so that the new one could begin on a surface that was, as nearly as human effort could make it, clean. The smell in the courtyard is sandalwood and something older than sandalwood underneath. The incense has been burning since before the sweeping, small cones of compressed resin set in clay holders along the base of the inner shrine, their smoke rising in thin, pale threads that the still morning air has barely disturbed. Sandalwood smoke has a particular quality that is difficult to describe without recourse to words that belong to other senses. It is warm but not heavy. It is sweet but not cloying. It occupies the air differently than other smells, not asserting itself, not demanding attention, but simply present, permeating everything it touches with an even, enveloping gentleness. To breathe it is to feel, almost involuntarily, something in the body begin to settle. The shoulders drop a fraction. The breath deepens slightly. The particular tension that comes from moving through the world releases, just a little, and the air itself seems to become quieter. This was understood. It was not accidental. The use of aromatic substances in Indian religious practice was ancient and deliberate, rooted in a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between the physical body, the sense organs, and the quality of mental and spiritual attention. Long before the Vedic hymns were written down on palm leaf and birch bark, before the elaborate systems of theology and philosophy that would eventually flower from this civilization into texts of staggering complexity and beauty, there was the simpler, more immediate knowledge that certain smells opened something in a person, that certain sounds carried a quality of vibration that the body received as much as the ears, that the careful arrangement of light and scent and sound in a dedicated space could prepare the human being for a quality of presence not easily arrived at through ordinary means. The priests of the ancient temples, and across the subcontinent, across the many centuries we are moving through tonight, the traditions of temple worship were as varied as the civilization itself, woke before the rest of the city not because their schedule demanded it but because the rituals demanded it. The first rite of the day, the opening of the deity's inner chamber, had to be performed at a precise moment in the pre-dawn darkness, when the specific planetary alignment of that hour was understood to be most auspicious. The deity, a carved stone figure, or a sacred flame, or in some traditions simply an empty space in which the divine was understood to be present in a way that required no representation, was awakened with the same ceremony with which a distinguished guest would be awakened in a noble house. Water was offered. Fresh flowers were arranged, marigolds and jasmine and fragrant champak blossoms, their petals still cool and damp from their pre-dawn immersion in a clay vessel of water. A small flame was brought close, swung in slow, deliberate circles, the arti, that ancient gesture of offering light, of bringing the warmth and clarity of fire before the divine as both greeting and gift. The brass bell at the entrance of the inner shrine was rung once. The sound it made traveled outward through the stone walls of the temple and into the courtyard and then into the lanes beyond, where the first people of the morning were already moving, and where the sound was received not as a disturbance but as information, a signal that the day's first ritual had been completed, that the divine had been properly greeted, that the world was proceeding as it should. People paused for a moment when they heard it, some of them. Some stopped mid-step, touched their fingertips briefly to their foreheads, murmured something too low to hear, and then continued on their way, the gesture complete, the acknowledgement made, the connection to something larger than the morning's practical concerns briefly and sufficiently established. This was the texture of the sacred in ancient India. It was not separate from daily life. It was threaded through it, present in the temple bell heard from the road, yes, but also in the small shrine set into the wall of a private home, in the turmeric mark pressed with a thumb onto a doorframe for protection and welcome, in the prayers spoken each morning at the river's edge, in the particular way a meal was prepared and offered before it was eaten, in the 100 daily acts of acknowledgement and gratitude and propitiation that wove the vertical dimension of the divine into the horizontal fabric of ordinary time. The Vedic tradition, the oldest continuously practiced religious tradition in the world, its roots extending back to the second millennium before the Common Era and perhaps further, was built on the concept of Rita, the cosmic order that maintained the world's integrity, the principle that held the seasons in their sequence and the stars in their courses and the river in its bed. Human beings participated in Rita through ritual, through the precise performance of prescribed acts at prescribed times, through the correct pronunciation of the sacred syllables that had been passed from teacher to student in an unbroken chain for longer than any individual could trace, through the offering of fire and grain and clarified butter into the flames of the yajna, the sacred sacrificial fire that was the central ritual technology of the Vedic world. The yajna fire was not a metaphor. It was an actual fire, built according to exact specifications in a specially prepared pit, tended by specially trained priests, fed with specific woods and specific quantities of ghee, accompanied by the chanting of specific verses from the Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedic texts, a collection of hymns of such antiquity and beauty that scholars of religion and literature have spent generations attempting to adequately characterize them. The hymns addressed the forces of the natural world, Agni, the fire, Indra, the storm, Varuna, the keeper of cosmic order, Surya, the sun, not as abstractions but as living presences, as beings who could be addressed, who responded to address, who were in some sense available to the human community if that community approached them with the proper combination of knowledge and reverence and material offering. In the courtyard now, a small group of people had gathered for the mid-morning ritual. They were not all from the same household. Some had come from neighboring lanes, drawn by the bell or by habit or by whatever particular quality of need had brought them here on this particular morning. An elderly woman sat near the front, her legs folded beneath her with the ease of someone who had been sitting this way her entire life, her eyes half closed, her lips moving in a private recitation that had nothing to do with the ritual being conducted and everything to do with the interior life she maintained alongside it. Behind her, a young man stood very still, watching the priest with an expression of focused attention that was almost impersonal, the attention not of the devotee absorbed in feeling but of the student absorbing information, storing it, comparing it with what he had been taught. The priest moved through the ritual with an efficiency that was not the same as haste. Each gesture was complete. Each word was given its full weight. The garland of flowers was offered, held out with both hands in the ancient gesture of presentation that required not just the physical offering but the internal orientation, the turning of attention fully toward what was being addressed, the suspension, for the duration of the gesture, of everything else. The flame was brought forward. The bell was rung again, this time 3 times in quick succession, the sound stacking briefly on itself and then dispersing into the warm air of the courtyard. Outside the temple walls, a vendor had arranged a small display of offerings for sale: flower garlands, small packets of vermilion powder, sugar balls pressed into rounds the size of a thumb, fresh leaves of tulsi, the sacred basil plant whose smell was considered itself a form of blessing and whose presence in a courtyard was so common as to be nearly universal, a small dark green plant in a clay pot that occupied its designated place with quiet authority. A woman stopped, selected a garland and a small packet of powder, pressed a coin into the vendor's hand without looking up, and continued through the temple gate. The sandalwood smoke drifted. The bell's last ring had dissolved completely into the air, leaving behind it a silence that was not the same silence as before, denser, somehow, more settled, the silence of a space that had been properly used and had given back something in the using. The stone floor of the courtyard, still cool in the shade of the surrounding walls, held the morning without comment. A single marigold petal lay near the entrance to the inner shrine, brilliant orange against the pale gray stone, displaced from some offering and not yet swept away. It would wait there until evening. And it was, in its small way, entirely enough. The afternoon light comes through the latticed wooden screen at a low angle, laying a pattern of thin gold bars across the stone floor that shifts almost imperceptibly as the sun moves, slowly enough that you cannot see the movement, only notice, from time to time, that the pattern has changed, that what was illuminated a moment ago has passed into shade and something else has been touched by the light in its place. The room is cool in the way that only thick-walled stone rooms are cool in the heat of the afternoon, a coolness that does not depend on the wind or the time of day but on the sheer thermal mass of the walls themselves, which have been absorbing and releasing the temperature of 100,000 consecutive days and have arrived, through that long process, at a kind of equilibrium, a settled, permanent moderateness that the outside world with all its seasonal drama cannot penetrate beyond a certain depth. This is a room for thinking. Everything about it has been arranged to serve that purpose. Along one wall, a series of narrow shelves hold bundles of palm leaves tied with cord, each bundle a text, a record, a carefully preserved accumulation of someone's knowledge, their observations, their arguments, their conclusions drawn from years or decades of study and practice. The palm leaves have been prepared with great care, dried, smoothed, treated with oil to prevent insects, inscribed with a stylus whose marks are fine and even and will remain legible, if the leaves are properly maintained, for centuries. They are stacked with their spines outward, and on each spine a small tag indicates the contents, the name of the text, the teacher from whom this particular copy descends, the subject, the lineage of transmission through which this knowledge has arrived in this room. The university at Takshashila, located in what is now northwestern Pakistan, in the region the ancient world knew as Gandhara, was one of the earliest and greatest centers of learning in human history. At its height, it attracted students from across Asia, from the kingdoms of the Gangetic Plain, from Persia and Babylon and Central Asia, young men making journeys of weeks and months to arrive at its gates and present themselves to a teacher and ask to be taught. The subjects available were remarkable in their range, the Vedic scriptures and the philosophy that had grown from them, grammar and linguistics, mathematics and astronomy, medicine and surgery, statecraft and military science, music and the fine arts. A student might spend 8 or 10 years in residence, moving from one teacher to another as his studies developed, accumulating not just knowledge but the capacity for a quality of rigorous inquiry that was itself the university's deepest teaching. The teachers were not employees of an institution in any modern sense. They were independent scholars who had accumulated sufficient knowledge and reputation to attract students, and whose compensation came from the students themselves, in the form of service, in the form of gifts, occasionally in the form of money, but more fundamentally in the form of the relationship itself, the transmission of knowledge requiring a closeness and a continuity of contact that created bonds between teacher and student that were among the most significant of a person's life. To study under a great teacher at Takshashila was to enter their household, to eat at their table, to observe them not just in the formal moments of instruction but in the way they moved through their ordinary days, the way they handled uncertainty, the way they treated people of lower and higher status, the way they thought when no one was performing for anyone. The knowledge did not exist separately from the person who held it. This was understood. Move further into the room now. At the far end, near the low window through which the afternoon's one shaft of light enters, a man sits with a palm leaf manuscript spread across his knees. He is reading with the particular stillness of someone who is not merely taking in information but weighing it, holding each sentence against what he already knows, testing it, looking for the point at which it confirms or complicates or contradicts his existing understanding. He is a physician, or rather, a student of medicine in the tradition of Ayurveda, that ancient, elaborate, and astonishingly comprehensive system of medical knowledge that understood the human body not as a machine to be repaired but as a dynamic, living system in constant relationship with the larger world it inhabited. The word Ayurveda means, in the most direct translation, the knowledge of life. It is a precise name. Ayurveda was not a system of disease management. It was a complete philosophy of living, of how to eat and sleep and move and breathe and relate to other people and to the natural world in ways that maintained the body's inherent intelligence and prevented the imbalances that eventually manifested as illness. The foundational texts, the Charaka Samhita, the Sushruta Samhita, composed and compiled over centuries and reaching their current form in the early centuries of the Common Era, contain within them observations about human physiology, about the properties of plants and minerals and animal substances, about the relationship between mental states and physical health, that continue to generate serious scholarly attention and that have, in numerous instances, been validated by the methods of contemporary science. The physician in this room has been studying for 6 years. He knows the properties of several hundred medicinal plants, not as a memorized list but as a living knowledge, acquired through years of handling the plants themselves, grinding and tasting and smelling and observing, going with his teacher into the hills at specific seasons to gather specific plants at the precise moment of their potency. He knows that the bark of the neem tree, ground to a paste, reduces fever and repels insects. He knows that ginger, fresh, dried, and prepared in various decoctions, addresses a range of digestive and respiratory conditions through mechanisms he understands in the language of Ayurvedic theory rather than in the language of biochemistry, but the practical understanding is no less accurate for the difference in vocabulary. He knows the pulse. He knows how to read the rhythm and quality and depth of a person's pulse at 3 different points on the wrist and draw from that reading a detailed picture of the condition of that person's internal organs and vital systems, a diagnostic technique of such subtlety that it requires years of practice before it becomes reliable and decades before it becomes truly fluent. His teacher, an older man, compact and quiet, whose hands when he was not using them rested on his knees with a stillness that was itself a kind of teaching, had told him once that the most important instrument of medicine was attention. Not the knife, not the herb, not the formula or the procedure. Attention. The capacity to be fully present with the person before you, to set aside your assumptions and your eagerness to arrive at a diagnosis and simply observe, to let the patient's body tell you what it needed to tell you before you decided what you thought. Medicine practiced without this quality of attention, the teacher said, was a dangerous thing, not because it would always cause harm, but because it would so often miss the essential thing, arriving at a partial truth and mistaking it for a complete one. The student had written this down on a piece of palm leaf. It sat in a bundle on his shelf, retrievable, a record of that conversation on that particular afternoon some years ago, when the light had come through a different window at a different angle but with the same quality of filtered gold, and the teacher's voice had been the same voice it always was, unhurried, precise, carrying within its very rhythm an illustration of the principle it was articulating. The Sushruta Samhita, the great surgical text of ancient India, contains descriptions of surgical procedures of considerable sophistication, including a technique for reconstructing a damaged or amputated nose using a flap of skin taken from the forehead. This technique, known in modern medicine as the forehead flap rhinoplasty, was rediscovered by European surgeons in the 18th century after reports of it being practiced in India reached Western medical circles, and it remains in use today in modified form. The instruments described in the Sushruta Samhita, over 100 of them, various knives and probes and forceps and catheters and tubes, are described with a specificity that indicates not theoretical knowledge but the hard-won practical knowledge of surgeons who had actually used them, who had learned through the irreducible education of practice what each instrument could and could not do. There were women who practiced medicine. The texts acknowledge their existence, and the social reality of a civilization in which women's health care required female practitioners made their presence not just acknowledged but necessary. They were not the dominant figures in the tradition as it has come down to us. The great named physicians were men, the prestigious university faculties were largely male, but the knowledge moved through women as well, in the domestic sphere, in the care of children and the management of childbirth and the long, practical pharmacopoeia of the household, where the line between cooking and medicine was not always clearly drawn. Outside the window, the afternoon is deepening toward evening. The gold bars on the floor have moved again, stretched longer toward the wall, thinner, the light losing the directness of midday and acquiring instead a softness, a warmth of color, the particular quality that the last 2 hours of sunlight carry in this latitude, generous and unhurried, as if the day itself is becoming, in its final hours, the version of itself it always meant to be. The student rolls the palm leaf carefully and sets it down. He sits for a moment in the cooling room, not reading, not writing, simply present with what he has read, letting it settle into whatever part of him would eventually make use of it. His teacher had told him that too. That understanding arrived not always in the moment of reading but later, in the silence after, when the thinking mind had quieted enough for something deeper to receive what had been offered. He sat a little longer in the quiet room. The light moved. The afternoon breathed slowly around him. Outside, somewhere across the city, an evening bell was beginning to ring. It begins with the smell. Before the first cloud has fully organized itself above the western horizon, before the wind has changed direction or the temperature has dropped or any visible sign has arrived to confirm what the body already knows, the smell reaches you. It comes from the earth itself, from the dry, cracked, dust-pale soil that has been waiting for this moment through 3, sometimes 4 months of rainless sky, waiting with the particular patience of something that has no other option, that has learned through its own deep constitution to simply endure and hold within itself the memory of water until water comes again. The smell the dry earth releases at the first approach of rain has a name in the modern world, petrichor, from the Greek for stone and for the fluid that runs in the veins of gods, but the people of ancient India knew it long before it had a name in any language, knew it with the whole body, knew it the way you know the smell of your own home after a long absence. Immediately and completely and with something that is not quite emotion but lives in the same neighborhood. The farmers knew it first. They were outside already, as they always were at this hour, and they felt the wind shift before they smelled the rain, a change in direction, a new softness in the air that was almost imperceptible against the skin but unmistakable to someone whose entire life was organized around the reading of exactly these signals. A man standing in a field to the southwest of the city straightened from his work and turned his face toward the horizon. The sky there had changed color. It had gone from the flat, bleached white of the late dry season sky, a white so complete it was almost aggressive, pressing down on the landscape with the full, indifferent weight of an unrelenting sun, to something darker and more complex, a blue-gray that moved as you watched it, deepening at its center, its edges catching the last of the afternoon light and holding it briefly in a silver fringe before the darkness absorbed that too. He called out to his son, who was working at the far end of the field. The son looked up, looked at the sky, looked back at his father, and in that exchange of glances the entire accumulated knowledge of the family's generations of farming this particular land passed between them without a word. They had perhaps an hour. The monsoon was not a single event. It was a season, the dominant structural fact of life on the Indian subcontinent, the force around which everything else was arranged, to which every other consideration was ultimately subordinate. It arrived from the southwest each year, borne on winds that had gathered moisture over thousands of kilometers of open ocean before meeting the land mass of India and being forced upward, cooling as they rose, releasing their accumulated water in quantities that were, to a person encountering them for the first time, almost beyond comprehension. In the hills of Meghalaya in the northeast, the monsoon delivered more rainfall in a single month than London receives in an entire year. Even in the drier inland regions, a single monsoon storm could transform a landscape, filling dry riverbeds to their banks within hours, flooding low-lying fields, turning the brown, cracked earth to a sudden vivid green that seemed to arise not gradually but all at once, as if the land had been holding the green inside itself all along and the rain had simply given it permission to appear. The monsoon's arrival was the single most anticipated event of the year. In the months preceding it, the long, building heat of March and April and May, when the temperature climbed and the air thickened and the wells dropped lower and the cattle grew thin, the entire civilization existed in a state of suspended anticipation, watching the sky, consulting the astronomical almanacs that predicted the rain's arrival with a precision that was sometimes accurate and sometimes not, making offerings at temples and conducting specific rituals designed to encourage the cloud's approach. The Vedic hymns contained prayers for rain that were among the oldest and most heartfelt compositions in the entire tradition, not abstract theological petitions but urgent, specific, almost desperate requests from communities that understood with complete clarity what the failure of the rains would mean. It would mean everything. The thunderhead that had been organizing itself above the western horizon for the past hour had now consumed a third of the sky. Its underside was the color of old iron, flat and dark and textured in ways that suggested enormous interior movement, vast columns of air rising and descending within it, the whole structure alive with processes on a scale that made the world beneath it feel very small and very still. The wind had picked up. It moved through the city's lanes with a new purposefulness, scattering dust and dry leaves and the petals of yesterday's market flowers in quick spirals, rattling the wooden shutters that had been hastily closed against the approaching rain, pulling at the edges of awnings and the loose ends of cloth and the hair of children who had not yet been called inside. Then the light changed. It went from the hot, flat brightness of the pre-storm afternoon to something diffuse and strange, the particular quality of illumination that exists only in the minutes before a major storm, when the direct sunlight has been blocked by cloud but has not yet been replaced by darkness, and the world exists briefly in a sourceless, shadowless, greenish half-light that makes everything look simultaneously more vivid and more fragile. The leaves on the trees, the sacred people, the wide canopied banyan, the mango trees whose fruit had been ripening in the dry heat for weeks, caught this light and held it in a way they never did in ordinary sun, their surfaces somehow more present, more insistently themselves. And then, from somewhere very far above, a single drop of water fell. It struck the dry stone of a courtyard floor and disappeared. Not even a mark. The earth was so dry it simply absorbed the moisture instantly, leaving nothing. But then another drop, and another, and then a pause that seemed to last much longer than it was, a held breath, and then the sky opened without further ceremony and the rain came down. The sound was extraordinary. It arrived all at once, a complete, overwhelming percussion, rain on stone and rain on leaf and rain on the clay tiles of rooftops and rain on the surface of the wells and rain on the dusty roads where it raised, for the first few seconds, tiny mushroom clouds of displaced dust before the ground accepted the water and the dust disappeared and the sound changed from a percussive clatter to a deeper, more sustained roar. The rain falling so thickly that it filled the air between things, made the middle distance disappear, turned the far end of a lane into a suggestion, a gray-blue shape behind a moving curtain of falling water. People ran. They ran laughing, mostly, the adults who had been caught outside pulling their cloth over their heads and running for doorways, children who had been called inside and had not obeyed now absolutely soaked within seconds, standing in the rain with their faces turned upward and their arms spread, receiving it. An elderly woman appeared in a doorway across the lane, watching the rain with an expression that was not quite happiness and not quite relief but something that contained both of those and something older beneath them, the recognition, lived and relived across the full length of a life, that this arrival meant survival, that the fields would recover, that the wells would fill, that the dry season's long anxiety could now, at last, be set down. Inside the houses, the change was immediate and total. The temperature dropped several degrees within minutes, genuinely dropped, the body registering it as a sudden gift, an unexpected reprieve from a heat that had been so constant and so complete that most people had stopped consciously perceiving it and would not know how present it had been until it was replaced by this cool, rain-smelling air moving through every open window, the walls breathing out the heat they had stored, the floors cool enough now to feel pleasant against bare feet. The smell inside a house during the first monsoon rain was of wet earth and wet stone and wet wood and the faint, sweet decay of old thatch absorbing water above the rafters, and underneath all of it the smell of relief, if relief has a smell, which in this context it did, which was simply the smell of rain itself, familiar and essential and deeply, primally reassuring in a way that no other smell quite replicated. The rivers responded within hours. Water that fell in the hills to the northeast reached the plains in a long, accelerating wave, the river rising visibly against the painted marks on the stone ghats, marks made for exactly this purpose, to track the monsoon's progress in terms that the entire city could read at a glance. Children ran to the riverbank to watch it rise, supervised by older siblings who kept them back from the edge with the casual authority of those who had done this before and knew exactly how quickly the water moved, how deceptively gentle it appeared from a distance, How different the reality was up close. The farmers returned to their fields the moment the rain allowed it. The soil was transformed, dark now, soft, releasing a smell so fundamental and so ancient that it seemed to come from somewhere below the personal, from some part of the brain that predated language and civilization and remembered, in its cellular way, that this smell meant the world would continue. The sowing could begin. The oxen were brought out. The plows were prepared. And across the vast, rain-soaked, suddenly fragrant subcontinent, in a million fields lit by the silver light of a sky still heavy with cloud, the ancient conversation between the human hand and the willing earth resumed, quiet, purposeful, unhurried, as it had always been, as it would continue to be, long after the names of individual kings and the borders of individual empires had dissolved back into the same wet, patient soil from which they had briefly arisen. The rain continued through the night, steady and unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. Which, in its way, it did. The city does not go dark all at once. It dims. Gradually, unevenly, one lamp at a time, the way a coal fire goes from flame to ember to glow to the last faint warmth that lingers in the ash long after any visible light has gone. The sun has been below the horizon for some time now, and the sky above the rooftops has passed through its sequence of colors, the brief, extravagant orange and rose of the immediate sunset, then the deeper red that followed, then the slow cooling through violet and indigo to the particular blue-black that exists just before the stars become fully visible, and now the night has properly arrived, settled, established, the darkness no longer a transition between day and night but a thing in its own right, with its own textures and sounds and particular quality of air. The air is cooler tonight than it has been. The monsoon rain from the afternoon has drawn the heat from the stones and the roads and the thick clay walls of the houses, and what remains is something gentler, a night air with actual movement in it, a faint, intermittent breeze that comes and goes without apparent purpose, lifting the edge of a cloth hung to dry on a rooftop line and letting it fall again, carrying across the lane the smell of a cooking fire being banked for the night and the last trace of incense from the temples. Evening ritual and something sweet and indefinable that might be jasmine from a courtyard garden, might be the river, might be nothing more than the smell of the world after rain. In the courtyard of the house we have come to know today, the family has gathered. They sit on woven mats spread across the stone floor, the grandmother nearest the small clay lamp that has been placed in the center of the group, its flame steady in the still air, casting a warm circle of amber light that reaches just far enough to illuminate the faces of those closest to it and leaves the edges of the courtyard in a comfortable, enveloping shadow. The children are arranged around the older woman with the instinctive gravitational pull of children toward the person they know will shortly begin to speak, two of them pressed close on either side, a third lying on his stomach with his chin in his hands, looking up at her with the particular quality of attention that children reserve for stories, which is total and unguarded and entirely without the self-consciousness that will eventually, in a few years, begin to complicate the way they receive things. She is not speaking yet. She is simply present, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes moving slowly around the small, lamplit circle of her family, taking an inventory that is also an act of gratitude, the nightly accounting of who is here, who is safe, who has come through another day intact. Her face in the lamplight is a map of a long life, not a diminishment but an accumulation, the lines and planes of it recording not age alone but everything age contains, the seasons, the griefs, the particular quality of joy that only arrives after sufficient loss, the deep, settled patience of someone who has learned through experience that most things pass and that the things which do not pass are the things most worth attending to. She begins, as she always begins, without preamble. The stories of ancient India were among the most elaborately developed narrative traditions in the history of human culture. The great epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, were not texts in the modern sense, not objects that existed in a fixed, final form between covers, but living traditions, carried in the memories of storytellers and recited aloud to audiences who already knew the stories and came to hear them again not for the surprise of the plot but for the pleasure and the nourishment of the telling. The way a person returns to a beloved piece of music not to learn what happens next but to feel again what it does to them, to receive from it what it has always given and will give again. The stories changed in the telling. They grew and elaborated and absorbed new material from the cultures they moved through, so that the version heard in the south of the subcontinent carried different textures and different emphases than the version known in the north, and both were correct, both were the story, because the story was not a fixed thing but a living one, and living things adapt. The grandmother's version of tonight's story is the version her own grandmother told her, in a different courtyard in a different city, on a night that must have smelled very much like this one, rain-washed stone and lamp oil and the particular warmth of a family assembled in a small space against the larger darkness outside. She does not think of this as she speaks. She simply speaks, the words coming with the ease of something so deeply memorized that it has passed beyond memory into the body itself, into the breath and the voice and the rhythm of the telling. The children listen without interrupting. This was itself something learned, something taught, the discipline of receiving a story in its completeness before beginning to respond to it, the understanding that a narrative had its own internal logic and its own timing and that to interrupt it was not merely rude but was a kind of violence against the thing being offered, a breaking of something that could not always be repaired. It was one of the first lessons in what the ancient Indian educational tradition considered the most fundamental skill, the ability to be genuinely, attentively, selflessly present with what another person was offering. To listen. Truly, fully, with the whole body and the whole mind and something beneath both of those. The lamp's flame moved once, slightly, in a breath of air from somewhere, and the shadows on the courtyard walls shifted and settled. In the rooms opening onto the courtyard, the other members of the household were engaged in the quiet work of winding down. A young woman sat near a window, her fingers still moving through the motions of spinning, the drop spindle turning slowly below her hand, the thread forming with a smoothness that came from years of practice, her attention only partially on what her hands were doing, the rest of it on the story being told in the courtyard, which she could hear through the open doorway in fragments and intervals. Her husband sat nearby with a palm leaf account book open across his knees, making small marks with a reed stylus, the day's transactions recorded in the careful, abbreviated notation of a man who would spend half an hour each evening on this task and no more, who kept his accounts as a sailor keeps a log, not with literary ambition but with the practical understanding that the written record was the memory that could be checked and corrected while the mind's memory could not. Across the city, the same quiet was falling in 1,000 other houses. The day's commerce and labor and ritual and conversation were completing their natural arc and settling toward the horizontal, toward rest, toward the long, dark, restorative hours that the ancient Indian medical tradition understood to be as essential to health as food and water and breath itself. The Charaka Samhita devoted considerable attention to the subject of sleep, to its proper timing, its proper duration, to the conditions that promoted it and the conditions that disrupted it, to the difference between sleep that nourished and sleep that merely passed the time. The ideal sleep began before the third watch of the night and lasted until the first birds began before dawn. The body needed darkness and quiet and a certain quality of mental release, the setting down, as deliberately as one set down a heavy vessel at the end of a long day's carrying, of whatever had occupied the waking mind. A dog barked somewhere in the lanes below, twice, and then was quiet. The temple bells rang the night's second hour, a distant sound, softened by the walls of the city between here and there, arriving at this courtyard as something barely louder than the sound of the flame, a vibration more felt than heard, absorbed into the chest rather than registered by the ears. The children did not react to it. They were deep in the story now, in that particular state of absorbed attention that has no awareness of itself, that has no outside from which to observe what it is doing, that is simply there, completely, in the lamplit world the grandmother's voice was building around them. The smallest child had shifted without noticing, had moved from sitting upright to resting sideways, her head now in her grandmother's lap, her eyes still open, still tracking the story, but slower now, the blinks longer, each one taking a fraction more effort than the one before to complete. Her breathing had deepened and evened. Her hands, which had been moving slightly with the story's action, were still. The grandmother's hand rested in the child's hair, moving in a slow, rhythmic stroke that was not quite conscious, not quite deliberate, but simply what the hand did when it was close to something small and sleeping or nearly sleeping. The flame of the clay lamp had settled into its deepest, steadiest burn, that quality a small flame achieves late in the night when the air is still and the oil is warm and there is nothing to disturb it, when it stands perfectly upright and perfectly constant and casts its light without any of the flickering and trembling of the earlier evening, as if it too has arrived at something like rest. The story was approaching its ending. The grandmother's voice had slowed with it, the sentences growing longer and quieter, the spaces between them wider, the words themselves chosen with the deliberate care of someone who knows that the ending of a story, like the ending of a day, required a particular quality of tenderness, a gentleness of conclusion that left the listener not stranded at the edge of something but eased across it, carried gently from the waking world into whatever came next. The second child had closed her eyes. The first was almost there, balanced on that exquisite threshold between attention and surrender, between the story and the dream, between this warm courtyard and wherever the sleeping mind would take him next, his breath slow and even and his body heavy in the way that only a completely relaxed child's body is heavy, a weight that is pure trust, pure safety, pure release. The grandmother's voice continued, very low now, barely above a murmur. The lamp held its single flame against the darkness. The city breathed around them all, slow and deep and settling. Outside, the stars had fully arrived. They covered the sky from edge to edge, the vast, unobstructed sky above an ancient city where no electric light competed with them, where they could be fully themselves, fully present, the entire visible universe displayed above the sleeping rooftops in a silence so complete and so immense that the small human sounds below, a voice, a flame, a child's slow breath, seemed not diminished by that silence but held within it, precious and particular and, in their smallness, somehow essential. The night deepened. The story finished. And the lamp, very quietly, continued its gentle burning into the dark. We have come back to the river. It is the same river it was this morning, and it is entirely different. The water moves in the same direction, carries the same quiet authority, speaks in the same low, continuous murmur against the stone steps of the god, but the light that falls on it now is the light of evening rather than dawn, and evening light does something to moving water that morning light does not. It deepens it. It turns the surface from pewter and silver to something warmer, something that holds within it the accumulated color of the entire day. The gold of midday softened now and drawn toward amber, the amber drawing toward rose at the western edge where the sun has just completed its descent, the rose fading as you turn eastward into a violet that is itself already becoming the first true blue of the approaching night. The river holds all of it. Holds and releases and holds again, the way water holds light, not by capturing it but by giving it somewhere to rest. Stand here a moment at the top of the god and simply look. The stone steps descend before you in their worn, familiar sequence, each one slightly different from the one above and below, broader here, narrower there, a crack running diagonally across the fourth step from the bottom that has been there so long it has been polished smooth by the feet that have crossed it, the sharp edges of the break rounded and softened by years of passing contact until it looks less like damage and more like a feature, something the stone itself intended. The steps are nearly empty at this hour. The morning's crowd of bathers and worshippers has long since dispersed into the city, and the evening's ritual has not yet fully gathered. There are a few people, a man sitting alone on the middle steps, looking at the water with the expression of someone who has come here not to do anything in particular but simply to be near this specific thing for a little while. A young woman moving slowly down toward the water's edge carrying in both hands a small clay lamp whose flame she is sheltering from the breeze with the curve of her palm, her attention entirely on keeping it lit. She reaches the bottom step and kneels, and with a care that is also a form of prayer she sets the lamp on the surface of the water. It floats. The river accepts it immediately, without ceremony, simply takes it, incorporates it into the slow movement of the current, carries it forward. The flame bends slightly in the motion of being set down and then steadies itself, and now the lamp is moving, gradually, gently, its small circle of amber light reflected in the water below it so that there are two flames, the real one and its twin, rippling slightly, keeping pace, and both of them growing smaller as the current carries them away from the god, out toward the center of the river, where the water moves a little faster and the lamp begins to turn slowly as it travels, its light describing a quiet arc across the darkening surface. It joins other lamps already on the water. There are perhaps a dozen of them visible from the god, scattered across the river's surface at different distances, each one a point of warm light in the growing dark, each one the remnant of a prayer or an offering or simply a moment of attention paid to something beyond the ordinary concerns of the day. Seen from a distance, from the far bank or from a boat in the middle of the current, they would look like a loose constellation laid flat on the water, irregular, unhurried, moving very slowly in the same direction, the spaces between them as meaningful as the lights themselves. This practice of setting lamps on the river at evening, the arti performed at the water's edge, the floating clay diyas released into the current as offerings to the river, to the divine, to the dead, to the simple fact of another day completed and another night beginning, is among the oldest continuously practiced rituals in the world. It was ancient when the earliest texts that describe it were written, ancient enough that its origins are not recorded because they predate recording, that it belongs to the layer of human practice that exists below history, in the deep substrate of the species-long relationship with fire and water and the coming of darkness. The people who performed it this evening did not think of it in those terms. They simply did what their parents had done, and their parents before them, reaching back through the generations in an unbroken chain of small, repeated gestures to a beginning so distant it had become, for all practical purposes, eternal. The city behind you is quieting now. The market has been packed away, the cloth merchants have folded their last bolt, the spice sellers have gathered their clay cups and covered them against the night's moisture. The money changer has balanced his accounts and put away his scale and walked home through the emptying lanes with the particular ease of a man whose work is finished. The cooking fires in 1,000 households have been banked or extinguished, the last meals eaten, the vessels washed and stacked. The temple bells have rung the evening's final service and the priests have closed the inner sanctum's doors and drawn the lamp flames down to their lowest, most contemplative burn. The scholars have set aside their palm leaf manuscripts. The healers have prepared their last remedies of the day and covered the clay pots with careful lids and washed their hands. The farmers have come in from the fields, their legs dark with the wet soil that the monsoon has made, their bodies carrying the good, heavy tiredness of physical work completed in full. The merchants have settled their accounts. The children have been carried to bed or have gone themselves, the resistance that begins the evening having dissolved, as it always does, into the deeper pull of the body's need. The city is breathing differently now. More slowly. More evenly. The sounds that remain are the sounds of settling, a door closing somewhere, a dog making its final rounds, the low murmur of a conversation between neighbors on a rooftop, their voices too distant to make out words, only the rhythm of speech and response, easy and unhurried in the cooling air. Come down the gaunt steps slowly. There is no reason to hurry. There has been no reason to hurry at any point in this long day, and there is even less reason now, in these last, generous hours before the darkness is complete. The stone steps are cool underfoot. The water at the bottom is dark and quiet, barely moving at the edge, the current staying out toward the middle where the river is deepest. You can see the bottom in the shallows, smooth pale stone and fine dark silt and the occasional marigold petal drifting slowly in a direction all its own, following some private current along the river's floor, still orange, still vivid, improbably intact. The lamp that was set adrift a few minutes ago is nearly out of sight now. It has traveled a considerable distance, small and steady, its flame still burning. It will travel through the night this way, carried along by the river's slow, enormous patience, past the ghats of other cities, past the fields and the forests and the sleeping villages, past the places where other lamps from other evenings have already gone dark and sunk, past all of it, the river continuing its journey without pause or preference, carrying everything it receives with equal and impersonal tenderness. This is what the river does. This is what it has always done. Sit here for a moment on the lowest step, where the stone is wet and cool and the water comes up to the edge of where you are and does not cross it. The sound of the current is very clear from here, not loud. Nothing about this river at this hour is loud, but present, filling the space between other sounds the way water fills the space between stones, occupying everything available with a completeness that leaves no room for silence but creates, through its own consistency, something that functions as silence, something that the mind receives as rest. The ancient civilization that lived beside this water, that built its cities on these banks and drew its sustenance from these rains and organized the whole elaborate, beautiful architecture of its daily life around the reality of this river and the seasons it obeyed, is not gone. This is the thing, the last thing, to understand before the night takes everything. It is not gone. The cities have changed their shape, and many of the names have changed, and the specific faces of the people who walked these ghats 4,000 years ago are not recoverable, their individual voices lost in a silence too deep and too old to sound. But the river is the same river. The stone steps are worn by the same feet, generation by generation, each set of feet pressing its infinitesimal contribution into the same stone until the stone curved to receive them. The lamp on the water is the same lamp, the gesture that placed it there the same gesture, the prayer beneath the gesture, unspoken, perhaps not even fully conscious, simply the human being's oldest and most persistent response to the coming of darkness, the same prayer. What we are, we have always been. What we have always been, we carry still. The night is nearly full now. The last color has left the western sky, and the stars are beginning their quiet accumulation above the river, appearing one by one, then in clusters, then all at once, the whole vast field of them becoming visible as the darkness deepens, as the eyes adjust, as the mind releases its grip on the day and allows itself to be absorbed by the larger dark. The water moves. The lamps drift. Somewhere in the city behind you, in a lamplit courtyard on a woven mat, a child has finally, fully, surrendered to sleep, her breath slow and even and complete, her body still, her face wearing that expression of absolute peace that sleeping children wear, which is the same expression they have worn in every city and every century, which is the same expression you wore once, long ago, before you learned to be anything other than entirely at rest. The river carries everything forward. The night holds everything gently. The stars above the water are very still. There is nothing left to do now. Nothing left to understand. The day has been lived, as days have always been lived here, with attention, with effort, with gratitude, with fire and water and the smell of rain on dry earth and the sound of a bell at dawn and the taste of something warm and spiced and nourishing and the particular weight of a sleeping child in your arms. It is enough. It has always been enough. Let the river take the rest. Let the darkness come. Let yourself, at last, be still.